Are women oppressed? Second wave feminists thought they were, and conceived of feminism as the movement for women's liberation, meaning freedom from that oppression. One way to approach this question, are women oppressed, is to simply understand oppression colloquially as something like the most severe form of disadvantage. Then we can use familiar population-wide metrics for social disadvantage and look at whether women do badly on these, or at least worse on these than other familiar social groups. We might consider things like length of life, frequency and severity of disease and ill health, victimization and crime, victimization or unequal treatment by government authorities or before the law, financial position, employment, and social stereotypes and attitudes about the group. Kate Phelan and I took this approach in our 2024 public lecture, Is Feminism Finished?, focusing on women in Australia. But another way to approach this question is to ask for more precision about the concept of oppression, first looking for a plausible account of this concept, and then simply asking whether this concept applies to women. And that's the approach we'll take in this lecture. We'll be asking first, what is oppression? What does it take for a person or group to be oppressed? And then we can ask, second, are women oppressed? Approaching the question this way opens up a number of possible answers. It could be that women were oppressed but are no longer, so the second wavers were right, but any feminist using this language today would not be. It could be that women never were oppressed and still are not. So not only is any feminist using that language today wrong, but the second wavers were wrong too. Or it could be that we were oppressed and still are. This word might strike us as hyperbolic, but once we fully understand what it means and fully understand women's situation, that initial reaction might disappear. And of course, it is worth noting that the political project of feminism does not stand or fall with the claim that women are oppressed. There are plenty of other concepts that a movement in women's interests might invoke, like that women are subordinated, marginalized, discriminated against, disadvantaged, dominated, mistreated, demeaned. I'm going to offer you 3 different accounts of oppression. They are due to T. Grace Atkinson, Marilyn Frye, and Iris Marion Young, respectively. The first 2 were built with women in mind. The third was built for everyone, and I've ordered them from most to least strict in terms of how many people would be likely to count as oppressed according to them. Let's start with Atkinson. T. Grace Atkinson writes in her 1970 essay, Some Notes Toward a Theory of Identity, published in her 1974 collection Amazon Odyssey, one way of defining oppressed people is just this, that we are so violated by another group/groups as to deprive us of our humanity. Our mental processes are absorbed so that choice and evolution are denied us. We are not discrete, we are not unique. Our time and activities are used, not to the end of each of our unique constructions, but as parts and additions to other individuals' ends. It is consistent with freedom for all if individuals use each other as perceptions or phenomena. It is not consistent with freedom for all when some individuals, oppressors, violate the discretion of other individuals by appropriating their, the oppressed, time and capacities to the fulfillment of the oppressor. There are at least 2 separate ideas here. One is that oppressed people are not for themselves, but for others. Think of slavery as the classic case. The slave's time and energy is directed toward the slave master's projects rather than their own. Instead of determining the shape of their own lives, an individual's mental and physical efforts are co-opted to the ends of some other person. This is what some contemporary theorists refer to with the concept of exploitation, with slavery and sweatshop labor as paradigm cases, but also organ sales, surrogacy, sex work, and the selling of alternative medicine to terminally ill patients. The other idea is that oppressed people are not unique individuals, but are rather interchangeable. You just need one of them. One is as good as any other. These ideas together give us a clear and narrow account of oppression, when one group violates another in the respect of appropriating its time and activities or capacities to the first group's ends, and when members of that group whose efforts are appropriated in this way are considered interchangeable, then that group is oppressed. Probably Marilyn Frye's most famous essay is Oppression, in her 1983 book, The Politics of Reality. She says her aim is to make clear what is being said when we say that someone is oppressed, which is great because that's exactly what we want to know. And talking about her view in this course is apt, because she developed the view as one of the early lectures of her philosophy course, called Philosophical Aspects of Feminism, starting at the University of Michigan in 1974. Frye characterizes oppression in terms of constraints. The experience of oppressed people is that the living of one's life is confined and shaped by forces and barriers which are not accidental or occasional and hence avoidable, but are systematically related to each other in such a way as to catch one between and among them and restrict or penalize motion in any direction. It is the experience of being caged in. All avenues in every direction are blocked or booby-trapped. She uses the metaphor of a birdcage to explain this idea, and in particular to explain the importance of the whole structure of constraints in determining whether a group is oppressed, rather than looking only at one bar. If we imagine a birdcage with just one bar, we can see that the bird is still free. It can just fly around that bar. It is only with enough bars packed closely enough together that the bird is actually caged. And that lesson can be applied to thinking about social groups. Think of the group Rich White Playboys. She uses this group to give an example we might similarly think of as a cage with one bar. Suppose it is common that members of this group break limbs on expensive skiing holidays. They face a barrier, pain and injury, but it is just one barrier, and they can easily work around it. If women are oppressed, then, what are the bars of their common cage? Frye says two things that help us to think about the bars. One is about double binds. This concept was first introduced in 1956 in connection to schizophrenia. The authors refer to a situation called the double bind, a situation in which no matter what a person does, he can't win. For one example given by Frye, oppressed people are supposed to smile and be cheerful. If they do, they seem to acquiesce in their treatment. If they don't, they're bitter, difficult, unpleasant, traits that can lead to sanctioning, including violence. When it comes to women, the double bind includes sexual activity. If she's sexually liberal, she's a slut, and if she's sexually conservative, she's uptight or a prude. If she's raped, then if she was sexually active, it must be she liked it. And if she's not, it must be still she liked it, because she's presumed repressed and frustrated. Frye writes, "You can't win. You are caught in a bind, caught between systematically related pressures." This double bind also exists for women in whether they work outside the home or not, good worker but bad mother, or good mother but bad worker, bear children or not, raise children or not, marry or not, in all these cases, not a good woman, or a good woman but still a woman, less than a man, whether they are beautiful or not, is she preoccupied with her looks, shallow, vain, or not taking good enough care of herself, and more. We might think of all of these as bars that curve overhead. Go this way and you run into frigid, turn around and go the other way and you run into whore. Enough double binds can build a whole cage. But another way to construct bars is just to think directly about the constraints formed by social expectations of women. For Frye, these relate centrally to women's service of men. She writes, "There is a women's place, a sector, which is inhabited by women of all classes and races, and it is not defined by geographical boundaries, but by function. The function is the service of men and men's interests as men define them, which includes the bearing and rearing of children." She goes on, Whether in lower, middle, or upper class home or work situations, women's service work always includes personal service, the work of maids, butlers, cooks, personal secretaries, sexual service, including provision for his genital sexual needs and bearing his children, but also including being nice, being attractive for him, etc., and ego service, encouragement, support, praise, attention. Women's service work also is characterized everywhere by the fatal combination of responsibility and powerlessness. We are held responsible, and we hold ourselves responsible for good outcomes for men and children in almost every respect, though we have in almost no case power adequate to that project. And Fry says a little later, the service sector of the wives, mamas, assistants, girls is almost exclusively a women-only sector. Its boundaries not only enclose women, but to a very great extent keep men out. Once we see the cage, we can ask who put the constraints in place, who maintains them, and who do they benefit? And Fry is very clear about who this is: men. If we accept her account of oppression and of what women's cage is built out of, we can also identify the oppressor. Women are oppressed by men. Fry's account of oppression is general. For any social group, we can ask what constraints it faces and whether there are enough that we consider there to be a whole structure metaphorically caging them in. In characterizing women's oppression in particular, she refers to expectations of service. But that means service is not a necessary condition of being oppressed. It's just a way to be oppressed, the way that women are in fact oppressed according to her. Fry and Atkinson are in agreement that women are oppressed because men exploit women, but Fry's account makes space for other ways to be oppressed than exploitation, where Atkinson's does not. Iris Marion Young's view, presented in a chapter of her 1990 book, Justice and the Politics of Difference, is quite different to the first two. She says explicitly that she is working backwards from the self-description as oppressed by social movements in the United States. That is to say, she's starting from who thinks of themselves as oppressed and then trying to work out what oppression must be. She includes, among others, women, Blacks, Chicanos, Puerto Ricans, and other Spanish-speaking Americans, American Indians, Jews, lesbians, gay men, Arabs, Asians, old people, working class people, and the physically and mentally disabled. She says that these groups have something very general in common, namely an inhibition of their ability to develop and exercise their capacities and express their needs, thoughts, and feelings. But beyond that, she thinks there's no single definition, and that fights about who is most oppressed are pointless. Instead, she thinks of oppression as a family of concepts and conditions. This family has 5 faces. They are exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, and violence. Let's start with exploitation. This is a steady process of the transfer of the results of the labor of one social group to benefit another. She also notes that this transfer should be systematic and unreciprocated. Young seems to agree with Fry and Atkinson about women's service when she writes of feminism and exploitation. She says, women's oppression consists not merely in an inequality of status, power, and wealth resulting from men's excluding them from privileged activities. The freedom, power, status, and self-realization of men is possible precisely because women work for them. Gender exploitation has 2 aspects: transfer of the fruits of material labor to men, and transfer of nurturing and sexual energies to men. This is useful because it stretches beyond the family and into the market. Women do the bulk of the care work and emotional labor in workplaces too. Marginalization. Young writes, marginals are the people the system of labor cannot or will not use. Marginalization is perhaps the most dangerous form of oppression. A whole category of people is expelled from useful participation in social life and thus potentially subjected to severe material deprivation and even extermination. Young also notes that one can be marginal even with adequate shelter and food, for example, as many old people are. It can mean uselessness, boredom, and a lack of self-respect. About powerlessness, she writes, "The powerless are those who lack authority or power, those over whom power is exercised without their exercising it. The powerless are situated so that they must take orders and rarely have the right to give them. Without power, one has no authority, status, or sense of self." So perhaps the best example is someone working in the lowest levels of a sweatshop or factory who is dependent on the job, especially in conditions where their bosses are awful in a way they cannot risk standing up against. She doesn't talk about it, but it seems obvious that a lack of certain legal protections or political enfranchisement may also cause powerlessness. About cultural imperialism, she writes, "Cultural imperialism involves the universalization of a dominant group's experience and culture and its establishment as the norm." She says, "Those living under cultural imperialism find themselves defined from the outside, positioned, placed by a network of dominant meanings they experience as arising from elsewhere, from those with whom they do not identify and who do not identify with them. This can lead to the social group internalizing ideas about themselves which come from the dominant group." And finally, on violence, she writes, "Members of some groups live with the knowledge that they must fear random, unprovoked attacks on their persons or property, which have no motive but to damage, humiliate, or destroy the person. It is systematic when it is directed at members of the group simply because they are members of the group. It may be motivated by fear and hatred." On Young's view, like Fry's, oppression is group-based and systematic. But unlike Fry's clarity about who creates, maintains, and benefits from women's oppression, i.e. men, Young thinks there need not be an oppressor for there to be oppression, because she thinks oppression can be structural. By this she means, for example, unconscious biases, stereotypes, and institutional features of bureaucracies and markets, so that oppression can be systematically reproduced in major economic, political, and cultural institutions. While there need not be oppressors in her view, there are always beneficiaries, people who are privileged in relation to the oppressed. The way she's thinking about it, the same person can be privileged relative to some groups and oppressed as a member of others. For example, privileged as a man while oppressed as black, privileged as white while oppressed as a woman. Now that we have these accounts of oppression on the table, we can consider two further questions. The first is what they say about women. In particular, when we understand oppression that way, whether women are oppressed. The second is whether the accounts are equally plausible, and if not, what the plausible accounts say, or what the most plausible account says about whether women are oppressed. Fry, Atkinson, and Young all seemed to be in agreement that how women are in fact oppressed has to do with the appropriation of her labor in men's interests, which Atkinson called appropriation of her time and capacities, Fry called service, and Young called exploitation, using women to illustrate that particular face of oppression. Women's time and activities are used for men rather than for themselves. Women spend their time and energy on personal, sexual, and ego service for men. Men's freedom, power, status, and self-realization is possible because they have women as helpmates. Women channeling the fruits of their physical labor, for example, housework and childcare, and emotional and sexual labor, for example, providing him with emotional support and sexual intimacy/release, into men rather than themselves. This may be why Fry somewhat dramatically calls men parasites elsewhere in her book, even going so far as to suggest that men oppose abortion because they can relate to another parasite and don't want women to become emboldened in cutting off the one, because then she might just as well cut off the other. Oppression, understood in this way as appropriation or exploitation, applied to women more dramatically in the past, when women were forced out of work after they married and expected to commit to a lifetime of service as wives and mothers. Even those who were still expected to perform some kinds of work, for example due to poverty, still took on disproportionate burdens in the home. And this is still true for many heterosexual couples today. For example, studies done on working from home conditions during the COVID-19 pandemic showed that women's domestic labor had at least doubled. There's some more detail about this in Kate's and my public lecture that I mentioned already, or you can just ask your favorite AI buddy for academic articles about the second shift. Atkinson, Fry, and Young therefore all agreed, at least at their respective times of writing, that women were oppressed. If we accept their accounts of oppression and their applications of the accounts to women, then we are left with two possibilities. One, women were oppressed but are not oppressed any longer, or two, women were oppressed and still are. And remember that because oppression is a claim about a group, it's no objection to point to a few women who appropriate or exploit men's labor, or a few women who don't have their time and capacities appropriated or exploited by men. The question will be whether it's still true that women as a group are largely functioning as for men rather than for themselves. And for Atkinson's account in particular, whether women are seen as interchangeable in this respect. Does he just need a secretary, a decoration for his arm, a mother for his children, a warm body to use sexually? Will any woman, or at least any competent enough, thin enough, pretty enough, warm enough woman do? What about Young's four other faces of oppression? If marginalization means that your labor is refused anywhere, for example, you are not permitted to make any contribution to society, you are quite literally relegated to the margins, then this form of oppression does not apply and has never applied to women as a social group. Although it may apply to some women in virtue of other aspects of their identities, for example, their ethnic or religious group membership. But if it means that your labor is refused within the paid system, then women were historically marginalized by being relegated to limited forms of low-paid work and then forced to leave upon marriage. But at least in countries like Australia and the UK, they are no longer. Young said about powerlessness, without power, one has no authority, status, or sense of self. Again, this seems to describe women's historical situation, where she could not vote, or she was not allowed to work, she was denied an education and so could not gain authority, status, or a sense of self in the ways that men do. She lacked a sense of self when she was expected to find fulfillment as a wife and mother, living for others rather than for herself. The question in both of these cases will be, are there lasting structural impacts on our laws, our institutions, our social norms, our attitudes because of women's historical marginalization and/or powerlessness? If we can trace historical oppression through to current forms of disadvantage, then we might want to insist upon the concept of oppression for explanatory reasons. What about cultural imperialism? Feminists have talked about this idea in the context of men's control over the dominant cultural perspective, communication, ideas, and so on. Christine de Pizan wrote in 1405 about the absolute hegemony of men's views about women's natures. The opening pages of her book have her trying to read and becoming frustrated, wondering why on earth it was that so many men, both clerks and others, have said and continue to say and write such awful, damning things about women and their ways. She notes, it is not just a handful of writers who do this. It is all manner of philosophers, poets, and orators too numerous to mention, who all seem to speak with one voice and are unanimous in their view that female nature is wholly given up to vice. Or for a more modern version of this idea, take Carolyn Criado Perez's 2019 book Invisible Women, about data bias in favor of men. Young referred to the universalization of a dominant group's experience and culture, and its establishment as the norm. Perez's book reveals the universalization of men's experience and its establishment as the norm. For example, smartphones built to fit men's average hand sizes and crash test dummies built to test and ultimately prevent harm to men's average body sizes. Finally, violence. It's straightforward enough to apply this condition to women, thinking about, for example, rape, domestic violence, intimate partner strangulation, and so on. So, of the 5 faces of oppression, 3 apply straightforwardly to women, and either one or both of the remaining 2 apply historically and may have legacy effects. Overall, all 3 accounts of oppression say that women were oppressed, and pending some empirical investigation into the extent to which women's labour is still appropriated to men's ends. If it isn't, then only one says that women are oppressed, that's Young's, by way of the faces cultural imperialism and violence, and if it is, then all 3 say that women are oppressed. Our second question was about the plausibility of these accounts. One way to assess this is to think about whether we find the accounts plausible in their verdicts on other groups. Do they give us strange, revisionary verdicts, or do they get most of the obvious cases right? Suppose you are confident that the Uyghurs are oppressed and Catholics are not. Then you can check what each of the 3 accounts says about these 2 cases and adjust your judgments about the accounts accordingly. If Fry didn't get these 2 cases right, that might be a big strike against Fry's account. What's interesting about the appropriation/exploitation understanding of oppression is that it seems to get what we might call the big 3, race, sex, and class, right. It can describe, for example, racial or ethnic groups as oppressed on the basis of historical slavery and contemporary disproportionate relegation to the service sectors. It can describe blue-collar workers in underpaid and unhealthy or unsafe conditions as oppressed. Similarly, the desperate or destitute women who turn to prostitution or surrogacy, and all the women doing housework and childcare outside the market and without a fair share of their partner's income. But it can't vindicate as oppressed many of the groups that get attention today from those interested in social justice. Sexual orientation minorities, people with disabilities, the neurodivergent, the gender diverse, or for that matter, those that get attention from those cross with social justice activists for not caring about the groups they think they should, religious minorities, political spectrum minorities, or extremely poor white men. There is no appropriation of time and capacity for any of these groups in the service of another group, so these groups are not oppressed. Young's account is more generous. For example, it would allow us to acknowledge the oppression of people with certain types of disabilities as oppressed, on the basis of being marginalized from social contributions and/or paid work, or from being disproportionately subject to violence. What is more difficult about her account is that several of the faces leave perhaps a bit too much room to argue, in particular over what counts as cultural imperialism, the difficult distinction between statistical typicality and dominance, and when a group is rationally in fear of violence. For example, a decade ago, someone might have thought it was a bit weird that Jews kept fearing the next pogrom, although with the recent rise in anti-Semitism, their fears start to look well-founded. These difficulties might be a reason to be more cautious about Young's account. Even feminists who would like to be able to say that women are oppressed will need to think carefully about who else ends up oppressed on this way of understanding oppression. I said at the end of part 1 that the political project of feminism does not stand or fall with the claim that women are oppressed. Suppose you've decided that there are reasons to reject all of the accounts of oppression offered in part 2, or that on the one you accept, it turns out that women are not oppressed today. Should you proceed to drop out of this course and give up on feminism? Surprising no one, my answer is no. You should simply think about the issues facing women that you care about, and which of the alternative concepts are the best way to describe those issues. I've mentioned already exploitation, subordination, marginalization, discrimination, disadvantage, domination, and mistreatment. And from our discussions in part 2, we can add historical injustice and structural injustice. Perhaps some of these terms capture different aspects of women's situation, rather than any one of them getting it perfectly right. For example, discrimination seems adequate when we're thinking about the motherhood penalty and work, while exploitation seems adequate when we're thinking about women's disproportionate contributions to domestic labor. Some feminists argue that the way women are portrayed in pornography is subordinating. Well, if we're interested in domestic violence and rape, we might need to talk about mistreatment. And if there's no recourse against that mistreatment, we might also need to talk about domination. All of which is to say, even if oppression isn't our central concept, there's still plenty more to be said.